Hey guys, Jeff here. Um, it's been a little while since I've done any kind of a talk about logical fallacies or critical thinking. And a conversation earlier today inspired me to talk about what I think is probably one of the most apparent, or at least one of the most interesting fallacies out there. And this is something known as the Galileo fallacy, or the Galileo Gambit. Now, it's named, as the name implies, after Galileo, who was, among other things, an astronomer from the late 16th and early 17th centuries. What he's probably most known for, among most people, is his support of the heliocentric model of orbit in our solar system. That is to say, the idea that the sun is the center of our solar system and all the other heavenly bodies, the Earth included, revolve around it. Now, this was controversial for a very long time, but some people had begun to accept it by the time Galileo came around. It's often considered a Copernican model because Copernicus was, in many people's eyes, the first major proponent of this idea. Now, why am I saying all this? Well, the point is that Galileo had a number of views that were considered controversial, many by the scientific community, but also many views not directly related to the heliocentric model that were considered by the Catholic Church to be challenges to their authority. Papal authority was very, very powerful, and the Inquisition at the time would investigate and lock up and sometimes even execute people who were viewed as being challenges to that authority. Galileo was viewed as one such challenge and was actually imprisoned on suspicion of heresy. And he, in fact, died while imprisoned. So, this is an example of somebody who was not allowed to share their views openly without being persecuted, without having his life ruined. People like to point to this as an example of how people can be silenced whenever they have a controversial or dangerous view that is in fact correct. And it is an example of that. The problem is that people like to think that just because they're being challenged, that makes them right. And it doesn't. Galileo wasn't correct because he had people that disagreed with him. All sorts of stupid ideas get disagreed with and should be. In fact, the vast majority of things that get presented to the scientific community and shot down are ideas that should be shot down because there's not sufficient evidence to believe them. There's not a logical reason to subscribe to that view, and the argument is just weak. So it's actually important. It's a necessary process, a necessary part of the scientific process for weak views to be challenged and dismantled. So it's not that he was challenged that made Galileo correct. What made him correct is the fact that he just was. His views about how the Earth revolved around the sun and how other heavenly bodies moved, including some of his observations on comets and planetary phases, observations of moons aside from our own. These are all things that he was the first person to make observations about that were correct. And it was found later on that he in fact was correct with many of these things that he said. And the scientific community, as it should, eventually adopted these views, all of the ones that were right. That's what the scientific community ideally does. The process of checking claims and evaluating them, scrutinizing them, and seeing if they hold up to that scrutiny is what allows us to learn what is true and what is not. People understandably feel offended whenever they are challenged on a view. It's very easy for us to feel as though we're being personally attacked when somebody says that we're wrong. But it's important to divorce our emotions from the claims that we're making. Because just because a person makes a claim against you or says that you're incorrect doesn't mean they necessarily think you're a horrible person. And even if they do, does that matter? No. We're talking about facts. We're talking about science. We are talking about a logical claim and evidence to support those claims. So that's what we should keep our focus on. Make it about the argument itself. If you're truly correct, you should be able to support it. If your entire argument is predicated on the idea that you're being persecuted and so you must be right, then you really don't have an argument at all. So that's what I wanted to mention. I wanted to make a quick talk about that. The Galileo Gambit is something that's employed many times when people feel the need or feel an urge to challenge whatever is the prevailing view on something. Whether you're saying that vaccines are a sham, that the medical establishment is out to get us all, that chemtrails are some kind of a cover-up. You see these things brought up over and over again where people say, oh, well, people that know the truth are just being silenced. Yet, ironically, the government or the establishment or the corporations never seem to figure out how to take down a YouTube video that talks about all of the conspiracies. So it really just comes from an ego sort of thing. It's one of the things that makes this fallacy, to me, very interesting. I think it speaks to the ego that we all have. It speaks to the very human tendency, the urge to protect ourselves and to hold on to our views as though they're something personal and to defend them tooth and nail when somebody challenges them. To feel as though we are personally attacked or persecuted because somebody says that we don't know what we're talking about. That's the Galileo Gambit. That's the fallacy. So hopefully that made some sense. I'm going to include a link in the description to the Rational Wiki webpage that describes this in a little bit more detail and gives examples of some other fallacies. But I think this is a really good one. So, yeah, hopefully you got something out of it. Leave a comment, leave a question. Let me know what you think.